I am Anthony Ambrose, and I am a tree biologist at UC Berkeley, and I study how climate change is affecting redwood trees. Redwoods are very tough and resilient to a lot of different kinds of stressors. Pests and pathogens they're very resistant to. They are really able to deal with fire. They have this really thick bark that allows them to be resistant to fire damage itself. They have an amazing ability to resprout new foliage, new crowns after being either disturbed from fire or other types of mechanical disturbance. They sprout prolifically, so that's a really strong adaptation of theirs. And they have an amazing ability to just grow for a really, really long time. And so they are able to deal with really divergent conditions over that, hundreds of years or thousands of years period. They have all sorts of physiological adaptations, so their leaf morphology changes as you go from the bottom of the crown to the top of the canopy. It adjusts to the light level and water availability. It's much more water stressed at the tops of the trees because it's brighter, warmer, drier, and also water has to get transported from the soil all the way up through the trunk all the way to the top. And as you go up further, water has to fight gravity and friction as it's moving up through the tree, and so the top of the tree is the most water stressed part of the tree. But they have all these really cool adaptations in their wood anatomy and their leaf morphology that allows them to deal with those really divergent conditions as they get bigger. And they can hold a lot of water so that during periods of low water, they tap into the water that's stored in their trunks and in the foliage. They have a really cool ability to absorb water directly through their foliage. Foliar absorption is the term. And that's really important so that they can take advantage of the fog here during the dry summer period. They instead of having to transport water dozens of meters, hundreds of feet off the ground, they are able to directly absorb water at the treetop, which really helps with water stress. They have this morphological adaptation in the foliage that allows them to take advantage of these vast, really big microclimatic gradients and gradients in water availability throughout the crown that allows them to have really deep crowns, that they are able to have a lot of foliage that's photosynthesizing. They have adaptations in the wood that reduces the amount of friction that is associated with transporting the water as they get taller. They are able to live a long time, and that is a real big benefit of why they're the tallest trees in the world, is they just live for thousands of years. They're also very shade tolerant, so they're able to shade out their competitors and be able to deal with a dense forest environment much better than a lot of other trees that might be otherwise growing here. So that's a big advantage that they have as well. Fire is an interesting thing in the redwood forest. We're here at the southern end of the range of the redwoods, where there's a lot more frequent and severe fire compared to the very northern range, which is very infrequent, and it could be catastrophic, but it may only be once every 500 years. Down here, we may get a fire in this grove every 5 to 15 years maybe. And the redwoods are adapted to deal with fire. They're very, they do very well under kind of this type of fire regime. I don't think they like it, but it does clear out a lot of the understory and competing vegetation, and they are able to resprout where other species may not be able to, and so that's one advantage, that they're able to take advantage of the fire. So the redwoods provide a whole unique set of biodiversity. The plants and animals that live in this forest are associated with the redwoods, and if they weren't here, it would be a completely different community. So they're a really important part of the native biodiversity. They only grow in this small part of the world, in the California coast, just over into the Oregon border. So redwoods themselves are iconic. People love them. They're unique. They're the tallest, one of the most beautiful trees in the world. And so inherently they have value that we care about, independent of the rest of the ecosystem that they support. They are also very important for carbon sequestration. They sequester and fix more carbon from the atmosphere than any other tree or forest type on the planet. So in terms of combating climate change, they're very important. They also have really important effects on the hydrology and the water cycle in this forest. They intercept the fog that comes rolling through here, and it causes fog drip, and they absorb the fog itself, and and then they re-transpire it, and they really help the water cycle in this particular part of the landscape. So they're really important from an ecosystem perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, as well as aesthetic and human value perspective. In terms of threats to the redwoods, I think they are pest and pathogen resistant, but as climate is changing, that might change. There might be some new insects or diseases that might come through here. We've seen recently in the last several decades the introduction of sudden oak death to these forests, which is having a big impact on the other trees in here. Something like that might happen. Conversion, most of the old growth redwoods have already been logged, and I think the biggest challenge now is restoring those lands that have already been previously damaged by previous industrial logging practices and road construction. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to restore the redwood forest ecosystem from past damage. Marijuana cultivation in certain parts of the range is a really big issue in terms of water withdrawals and introduction of poisons into the ecosystem and clearing of land for that. So those are some of the biggest threats I see. And with climate change, the fire regimes are going to likely be altered as well. So we might get more severe and frequent fires, and that might be a big impact on certain parts of the range, particularly here in the south, where it's already a fairly frequent fire regime and already pretty fire-prone landscape. So there's a pretty big climatic gradient from the very northern end of the Redwood Range up at the Oregon border all the way down here to the Big Sur coast. And it's much warmer and drier down here. And so we're here at the southern extent of the range of the redwoods. There's these small little pockets like you see here of redwoods in an otherwise very hot and dry, fairly hostile environment. Oaks and chamise and chaparral pine trees that are growing around here. And this little pocket here has kind of the spring that's coming out of the mountain that's feeding this grove. And these trees need a lot of water, hundreds of gallons of water a day for a single tree that's flowing through their trunk. And so they only grow in these little pockets down here. And as the climate is getting warmer, the evaporative demand of the atmosphere is increasing. It's drying things out more. It's altering precipitation patterns. And so the southern extent of the range here is going to be the first place where climate change impacts are going to be seen in the redwoods. And so we're really interested in how these trees are doing, how they respond to current environmental conditions, so that we can get a better idea of how they may respond to future conditions. Redwoods used to grow down to like the Santa Barbara. There's some evidence that they used to be further down and along the coast here in California, but past climatic changes over the last several thousands of years have caused them to retract their range. And so now they're kind of moving north, and there's these little refugia, these little pockets of redwood forest here that are still remaining, but in the future they might disappear, kind of like the ones that used to be down in Santa Barbara. And so this is the front lines of climate change impacts in the redwoods.
My name is Wendy Baxter, and I'm a researcher at UC Berkeley. I've been working with Anthony Ambrose for the past 8 years, trying to understand how coast redwoods and giant sequoias are responding to climate change, and more recently, California's historic drought.
So in 2009, we partnered with the Save the Redwoods League and colleagues at Humboldt State University and our team at UC Berkeley to look at how climate change was affecting the coast redwood and giant sequoia trees and forests. And so we spent 3-4 years installing permanent reference plots where we plotted out the stand structure, the crown structure, got a bunch of physiology, microclimate, other types of data from plots that we established throughout the range of both species, all the way from the very northern extent to the southern extent of their species, which span a pretty big climatic gradient.
One of the great things about having been part of the Save the Redwoods League funded Redwoods and Climate Change Initiative was it really gave us a lot of good baseline information to then go and do additional research. So we had actually, one of our plots was here at this UC reserve. So we already had sort of an understanding of how the trees were doing here and knew that it was one of the sites that wasn't doing as well compared to the sites farther north. So that was really important information to help us sort of choose locations to do future research. And, you know, anytime there's a big project like that, you learn so much and then you can build off of that knowledge.
The plots that we established were meant to serve as kind of a baseline for studying these places into the future. We put them in old growth forests where there had been kind of minimal human activity or effects, so we could kind of pick up a climate signal if there was one. So we established a bunch of baseline data in terms of the stand structure, how much carbon above ground biomass they have, how they were growing. We found that the coast redwood so far in our data analysis has more biomass, more carbon above ground than any other forest in the world, which is not surprising. They're the tallest trees in the world and very dense and old. We've also found that in the last 50, 60 years, a lot of the trees, not all of them, but a lot of them are growing more than they have been over the last several hundred years. And we're still trying to understand why that might be. The good news is that they don't appear to be negatively impacted by climate change at this point. So that was good news. We don't know whether this growth surge is going to be sustained into the future or what's driving that pattern. And that's kind of subject of ongoing research. There's a couple mechanisms that we think might be responsible for this growth surge. One is increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which is the source of their photosynthesis and their food that basically they're growing. So there might be some fertilization effect from increasing carbon dioxide levels. There might be a change in the frequency of the fog in the coast here that is increasing the light levels that is driving photosynthesis. And also air pollution on the coast. Back in the 50s, there was a lot of burning of logging waste up in Humboldt County and along the coast, and they stopped that for air quality reasons. And so after like 1970 or something, they stopped that, and so the light levels might be increasing due to that as well. So there's a couple different potential reasons.
So the trees here at Big Creek didn't see the same sort of growth surge that some of the other sites did farther north. A lot of the coast redwood and giant sequoia sites seem to have improved their growth over the last several decades, and Big Creek was not one of those sites that showed that big growth surge. And we don't know exactly why, but so that's one of the reasons why we thought it might be an interesting place to study in a little bit more depth. Here, Anthony Ambrose is leading this research at the Landals Hill Big Creek Reserve, and he has these instruments that are taking measurements every 15 minutes, which is pretty cool because when we were doing this work in the giant sequoias, we had to climb to the top and collect a sample and bring it down, and we would get one measurement. But these are continuously making these same measurements.
We are studying 5 individual coast redwood trees here, right behind me and throughout this grove, and comparing their water status and water movement and growth with some coast live oak trees that are growing just right next to this grove here. And we're really interested in comparing the oaks versus the redwoods and how they deal with seasonal changes in water availability and atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, and how they might be responding to variations in both soil and atmospheric water stress. Because drought is already a really big feature of California's landscape, and in the future, climate models are projecting that we're going to be having more severe and frequent droughts, like we just recently saw one in the last couple of years. And so we're really interested in understanding how these trees are responding to water availability and changes in that. And so the oaks have a very different physiology and adaptations to deal with drought. And in the future, this landscape, if we get more persistent droughts and water availability changes, it might shift to more of an oak-dominated landscape, and these redwoods might disappear. So we're really trying to understand that. We're focused here now because these sensors are very expensive and intensive to work with, and so we only have a limited number of them. So we're focused right now in this particular grove to get these measurements, and we want to expand that down into the future to other parts of the range of the redwoods. So we have one set of sensors that we're measuring what's called the water potential. It's basically a measure of how much tension the water is under, how water stressed the tree is. They're called psychrometers. It's a psychrometric principle that we measure the water status of the trees. We also have other sensors that we've inserted into the branches and trunks of these trees that measure the water flow, the sap flow of how much water is flowing and how fast it's flowing, and relate that to environmental conditions. So we also have some microclimate sensors measuring things like the temperature and the humidity and the light levels and the wind speed and soil moisture, so we can relate how the trees are doing. And we get these measurements every 15 minutes. So we're measuring the pulse of these trees and how they change over the course of the day, and how they change from day to day and over the course of the season, as you know, you have a wet, cold, dry, warm periods, and high soil moisture, low soil moisture. So we're capturing a gradient of environmental conditions and really coupling that with our measurements of how the trees are responding to those conditions. Most plants have this ability to close the stomata, little tiny pores in their leaves, when water conditions become scarce. And redwoods do that as well. They don't do it as well as a lot of other species like the oaks. So in terms of as water availability changes, things get drier and warmer, the oaks have a better ability to conserve their water than the redwoods. They just lose a lot of water, and so that's partly why they are dependent on growing in these places that have an abundant amount of water like this. In terms of the future, I think we're going to see a shift in the range of the coast redwoods. Some of these groves down here in the southern part of the range are probably not going to persist. Combination of water and fire maybe. But there's going to be refugia up in the north where conditions are going to remain pretty stable and continue to provide them with adequate conditions for them to grow up there. Animals have the ability to move. Plants don't necessarily, and so their migration rates naturally are very slow. And over geologic time and normal climatic conditions changing, they are able to kind of adapt and adjust and move their populations because of that. But with current climate change, the velocity of the change is so fast that many plants, especially long-lived trees like redwoods, might not be able to keep up with that. So we haven't seen any natural migration north. There are people starting to plant redwoods up in Oregon and Washington because they anticipate that it's going to be a better growing environment for them in the future. But I'm not aware of any natural migration yet. It's controversial, and like what about the plants that are already there and the native species, and are you completely altering the whole ecosystem? And it's there's some moral questions here of if we're altering the environment to such a degree that plants can't accommodate that, or any other animal can accommodate that. Do we have an obligation to help them, or let things just play out and see what shakes out? I don't know. It's tough questions. The genetics of redwood is very complicated. They're a hexaploid. They have 6 sets of chromosomes, and how they got that way and what that means for mutations and their adaptations going forward into the future is still an open question.
The species that grow and live on a landscape have a lot of impacts on the other animals and plants that grow alongside them and live amongst them. Coast redwoods provide wonderful locations for birds like the California condor to nest, or spotted owls, marbled murrelet. They're big enough trees, and they have big enough hollows that they're nesting cavities for these animals. And so if they weren't here, then those animals may have fewer locations to nest. Coast redwoods also have sort of a moderating impact on the environment here. Where we're standing right now is quite a bit cooler than over where the oaks are growing. It's quite a bit warmer over there. So that might affect the other plant communities that grow amongst them. And it affects water cycling and things like that. So if there's a wholesale ecosystem change, that will impact what other animals and plants can live here. I think with climate change, to some extent, we're going to have to accept that things are going to change. That's probably, that's what the Earth has done for its whole history. And of course, this time humans are causing this change. But coast redwoods are an iconic species that people love, and they think of the Big Sur coast as a place that they can come to see coast redwoods. So it might have tourism effects. It obviously has impacts on the ecosystems and the services that they provide. So I think, in a way, it's kind of sad to think about this coast no longer being a place where coast redwoods could grow. But who knows? They are pretty resilient, and they have a lot of tricks up their sleeves, so maybe they will be able to persist for a lot longer than we think.